The first scream came from row 11. Not because the plane dropped, because it didn't stop dropping. For nearly 4 seconds, the aircraft felt weightless. Coffee cups floated. Seat belts snapped tight. A laptop launched into the ceiling. Then the Boeing 737 slammed sideways hard enough to rattle every window in the cabin. Gasps erupted. Someone cursed. A baby started crying. And in seat 8, Megan Cross opened her eyes. Instantly. The way people do when they've spent 20 years training their brain to wake up at the first sign of trouble. The cabin lights flickered once, then stabilized. Megan looked out the window. Clouds. Nothing but clouds. But she wasn't looking at the scenery. She was watching the aircraft, feeling it, listening to it. The engines sounded wrong. Not failing. Just wrong. Her jaw tightened. Across the aisle, a businessman laughed nervously. Turbulence from hell, huh? Megan didn't answer. Because something else bothered her. The plane wasn't behaving like it had hit turbulence. It was behaving like someone was struggling to control it. A few rows ahead, a flight attendant hurried toward the front of the aircraft. Too fast. Not running, but close. Professional panic. The kind passengers weren't supposed to notice. Megan noticed. She always noticed. For 12 years, she'd flown rescue helicopters for the Coast Guard. Before that, search and recovery operations off the Atlantic coast. Night missions, storm missions. The kind of flying that turned mistakes into funerals. And right now, every instinct in her body was awake. The aircraft rolled slightly left, then right, then left again. An ugly correction, like someone oversteering a car on black ice. The businessman stopped smiling. Okay. He glanced around. That feels weird. Megan finally nodded. Yeah. It did. The seatbelt sign illuminated. A sharp chime echoed through the cabin. Passengers exchanged nervous looks. Then the public address system crackled. Static. Heavy breathing. Silence. More static. The voice that finally emerged wasn't calm. It wasn't confident. And it definitely wasn't the captain. Ladies and gentlemen, the woman sounded young. Terrified. This is your lead flight attendant. The entire cabin went quiet. Megan sat up straighter. The flight attendant swallowed audibly. Then continued. We are experiencing an emergency involving the flight crew. A wave of confusion moved through the cabin. People looked at each other. Whispers started immediately. Emergency involving the crew? What did that mean? The flight attendant took another shaky breath, then said something that made Megan's stomach drop. If there are any certified military pilots on board, the voice cracked. Please press your call button immediately. Silence. Absolute silence. Even the crying baby stopped. For several seconds, nobody moved. The businessman beside Megan stared. What the hell? Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Megan looked down at her armrest, at the small silver call button, then toward the front of the aircraft. No lights appeared. No one stood up. No one responded. The flight attendant's request hung in the air, waiting. The aircraft suddenly lurched again. Harder this time. A collective gasp swept through the cabin. Somewhere in the back, someone screamed. Megan closed her eyes. Not because she was scared. Because she was thinking. She flew helicopters. Not airliners. That mattered. A lot. Commercial aircraft were completely different animals. Different systems. Different procedures. Different everything. If there was an airline pilot somewhere on board, they needed that person. Not her. She waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. Nothing. Nothing. No lights. No volunteers. No retired captain rising dramatically from seat 22 OK. Nobody. The aircraft dipped again. A rough, ugly movement. Whoever was flying up front was losing control of the situation, and they knew it. Megan slowly exhaled. Oh, hell. The businessman looked over. What? She reached up, pressed the button. The amber light above seat 8 illuminated. Immediately, the businessman stared. His eyes widened. You're a pilot? Megan grimaced. Sort of. Sort of? She unbuckled her seatbelt. I'm about to find out how sort of. Before he could ask another question, the curtain separating the main cabin from first class flew open. A flight attendant appeared, mid-20s, pale, shaking, desperate. Her eyes immediately locked onto the light above ATI. Then onto Megan. You're the pilot? Megan stood. I'm the closest thing you've got. The flight attendant grabbed her wrist. Not protocol. Not even close. But nobody cared about protocol anymore. Come with me. Fast. The two women moved toward the cockpit. Passengers watched silently. Some hopeful, some terrified, most confused. As they reached the front galley, Megan noticed something strange. Nobody from the cockpit was communicating. No captain. No first officer. No instructions. Nothing. Just silence. And silence was rarely good. The flight attendant stopped beside the reinforced cockpit door. Her voice dropped to a whisper. The kind people use when they're afraid saying something out loud might make it real. Then she looked directly at Megan and asked the question that changed everything. How much do you know about landing a Boeing 737? Megan stared at the flight attendant. For a second, she thought she'd misheard. Landing? The young woman nodded. Tears filled her eyes. Captain collapsed. Megan felt her pulse spike. What about the first officer? The answer came immediately. He's conscious. A pause. But barely. The flight attendant's voice shook. Something happened. Megan looked toward the cockpit door. Every scenario she'd imagined during the last 10 minutes suddenly became much worse. Because this wasn't a mechanical emergency. This was a human one. And human emergencies were unpredictable. Open the door. The flight attendant entered a security code. A few seconds later, the reinforced cockpit door clicked open. The moment Megan stepped inside, she knew the situation was serious. The captain lay unconscious behind his seat. An oxygen mask covered his face. A flight attendant knelt beside him, trying desperately to stay calm. The first officer was still sitting upright, but he looked awful, sweating heavily, skin pale, hands trembling. His eyes found Megan. You the pilot? His voice sounded weak. Very weak. Megan nodded. Helicopters. The first officer actually laughed. A short, exhausted laugh. Today's your lucky day. Megan wasn't sure she agreed. She moved closer. The cockpit windows showed nothing but dense clouds. Rain streaked across the glass. The aircraft jolted again. The first officer winced, then pointed toward the instrument panel. Autopilot's holding. For now? Megan looked over the displays. Years of aviation experience helped, but airline systems were still a different world. Like a mechanic who normally worked on trucks, suddenly being asked to repair a train. Some things translated. Some didn't. What happened? The first officer swallowed. Food poisoning. Megan blinked. What? Captain and I ate the same airport meal. A painful smile crossed his face. Dumbest decision of my career. Another wave of turbulence hit. The aircraft shook violently. Warning tones chirped somewhere in the cockpit. The first officer grabbed the armrest, trying to stay focused, trying not to pass out. How long have you been like this? 30 minutes. Megan stared at him. 30 minutes. This man had been flying a passenger jet while seriously ill for 30 minutes. No wonder the aircraft felt unstable. A radio transmission crackled through the speakers. Air traffic control. The first officer reached for the microphone. His hand missed. Megan caught it before it hit the panel. The man looked embarrassed. I don't think... He stopped, closed his eyes, then tried again. I don't think I can finish this. For the first time, real fear entered the cockpit. Not panic, not chaos, just reality. The first officer knew his limits, and they were arriving fast. A controller's voice filled the cockpit again. Professional, calm, steady. Flight 782, do you copy? The first officer gestured weakly toward the microphone. Answer them. Megan grabbed it. Her hand felt strangely calm. Years of emergencies had taught her something important. Panic never solved anything. Air traffic control, this is passenger Megan Cross assisting in the cockpit. Several seconds of silence followed. Then, passenger? The controller sounded confused. Affirmative. Megan glanced toward the first officer. The captain is incapacitated. First officer is medically compromised. Silence again. Then suddenly, the controller's tone changed completely. All business. Copy that. A second voice joined the frequency. Then, a third. Controllers. Supervisors. Emergency coordinators. The entire system was waking up. One controller spoke clearly. Miss Cross, are you a licensed pilot? Megan answered honestly. Former Coast Guard rescue pilot. Another pause. Then, we can work with that. Megan appreciated the confidence, even if she didn't share it. For the next 20 minutes, the cockpit became a classroom. Controllers. Airline specialists, ground instructors, everyone feeding information, everyone trying to solve the same problem. Get 148 passengers safely onto the ground. The first officer helped when he could, corrected procedures, verified settings, explained systems. But with every passing minute, he grew weaker. Eventually his head leaned back against the seat. His breathing shallow, his voice fading. Megan realized something terrifying. Soon, she would be alone. Outside the cockpit, the passengers knew almost nothing. Rumors spread quickly. Heart attack. Engine failure. Hijacking. Nobody knew the truth, except one elderly woman in row 3, because she'd quietly watched the flight attendants. Watched their faces, watched their fear, and understood. She reached across the aisle, took her husband's hand, and squeezed it. Neither spoke, neither needed to. Sometimes people know when they're witnessing a moment they'll remember forever. Back in the cockpit, the weather radar lit up red, then yellow, then red again. Megan stared. Storm cells. Huge ones. Directly ahead. The controller's voice returned. And what he said next made the situation infinitely worse. Ms. Cross. She swallowed. Go ahead. A pause. Ambitious. Then, the nearest airport capable of handling your landing is now reporting severe crosswinds. Megan looked at the windshield, at the rain. Hi. At the storm. At the unconscious captain. At the first officer barely staying awake. Then at the instrument panel, she was still learning in real time. And for the first time since leaving Sidete, she wondered whether this was actually possible. Then another transmission arrived. Different voice. Different controller. Urgent. Ma'am? What? Not. A pause. Then the words nobody wanted to hear. The storm is moving faster than expected. The controller exhaled slowly. You have less than 30 minutes before the runway becomes unusable. And, suddenly, the emergency wasn't just about landing the airplane. It had become a race against time. The first thing Megan did was stop looking at the storm. Because the storm wasn't the real problem. The real problem was the airplane. One problem at a time. That was something she'd learned during rescue missions years ago. Focus on the thing you can control. Ignore the rest. The controller's voice returned through her headset. Miss Cross, we're going to walk you through everything. Megan nodded automatically. Then remembered they couldn't see her. Copy. Go. The first officer shifted weakly beside her. His eyes barely open. You've got this. Megan laughed. It came out sounding more terrified than confident. I really don't. Neither do I. For some reason, that made both of them smile. Briefly. Then another wave of turbulence hit. The aircraft shuddered hard. Warning lights flashed. Passengers gasped behind the cockpit door. The reality of 148 lives sitting a few feet behind them suddenly felt very heavy. A controller spoke again. Listen carefully. Megan straightened. We're diverting you to Wichita. Wichita? Runway is longer. Emergency crews are already in position. Megan looked at the navigation display. The city appeared ahead. Not close, but reachable. If everything went right. A dangerous phrase. If everything went right. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur. Controllers talked. Megan listened. The first officer corrected things when he could. Weather updates arrived constantly. Wind speed. Approach path. Visibility. Every number seemed worse than the last. At one point, a controller asked, Fuel status? The first officer opened one eye, looked at the display, then answered weakly. Enough for one attempt. Silence filled the cockpit. One attempt. Not 3. Not 5. Only 1. Megan didn't say anything. Neither did the controller. Because everyone understood what that meant. The airplane descended through thick clouds. Rain hammered the windshield. Visibility disappeared completely. Nothing outside looked real anymore. Only gray. An endless wall of gray. The radio crackled. Cabin secured. The lead flight attendant. Still scared. Still doing her job. Megan admired that. Fear wasn't the absence of courage. Sometimes courage was simply continuing anyway. The first officer suddenly pointed ahead, his hand trembling. Watch your speed. Megan adjusted. The controller immediately responded. Good correction. Another voice joined. An airline instructor on the ground. A retired captain. Someone who had probably flown thousands of landings. His voice sounded calm. Almost fatherly. You don't need a perfect landing. Megan listened. You just need a safe one. Simple words. But they helped. A lot. The aircraft continued descending. 10,000 feet. 8,000. 6,000. The storm intensified. Rain became sheets of water. Wind shoved the aircraft sideways. The control yoke felt alive in Megan's hands. Fighting her. Testing her. Demanding respect. For the first time, she truly understood something. Commercial pilots were extraordinary. Most passengers never thought about that, never appreciated it. But sitting here, holding this machine in the middle of a storm, she felt nothing but respect. The first officer's voice suddenly returned. Soft, barely audible. Megan, duh. She looked over. What? What? The man smiled weakly. If we get down. A cough interrupted him. Then, first round of drinks is on me. Megan laughed. Actually laughed. You better survive long enough to pay. The first officer nodded. Fair deal. 3,000 feet. The controller spoke again. You're doing great. Megan wasn't sure she believed him, but she appreciated the effort. Suddenly, the clouds broke, and the runway appeared. Far ahead. Tiny. Distant. A narrow strip of light cutting through the storm. Megan felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by terror, because now came the hard part. Landing. The crosswind hit instantly. Violent. Dot. The airplane lurched sideways. Warning alarms chimed. The runway shifted in the windshield. The aircraft no longer pointed where it was traveling. A controller's voice sharpened. Correct. Dot. Megan corrected. Too much. The aircraft drifted. The retired captain's voice joined immediately. Easy. She adjusted again. Better. Not perfect. Better. Better. The runway grew larger. Faster. Closer. Guy. The passengers couldn't see the instruments. Couldn't hear the controllers. Couldn't understand the calculations. All they knew was that the airplane felt wrong. Very wrong. In row 11, Nanijaya, a woman grabbed her husband's hand. In row 24, Andy, a teenage boy whispered a prayer. In row 3, Mary, the elderly couple sat perfectly still, eyes closed, waiting, trusting strangers they'd never meet. The runway lights expanded ahead. Almost there. Almost. Then a warning tone suddenly erupted through the cockpit. Loud. Sharp. Dot. Unexpected. Megan's heart jumped. What was that? The first officer looked up. His face instantly changed. Not fear. Worse. Concern. Real concern. He checked a display. Then another. Then whispered 2 words. 2 words that made the entire situation even more dangerous. Hydraulic problem. Megan stared. What? The first officer swallowed. Rain battered the windshield. The runway rushed toward them. Controllers started talking simultaneously. The cockpit exploded with voices. And for the first time during the entire emergency, nobody seemed completely sure what would happen next. The aircraft was less than 2 minutes from the ground. And now, something else was failing. For half a second, nobody spoke. Not the controllers. Not the instructors. Not even the first officer. The warning tone continued. Relentless. Demanding attention. Megan gripped the controls tighter. Tell me what that means. The first officer's eyes moved across the displays. His training took over. Even exhausted, even sick, instinct carried him forward. Not total failure. A pause. At least, not yet. Megan wasn't sure whether that was comforting. The retired captain on the radio jumped in immediately. Listen to me carefully. Megan nodded. You're still flying the aircraft. Focus on the runway. Don't chase every warning. Good advice. Simple advice. The kind that mattered during emergencies. The runway lights shimmered through sheets of rain. Still there. Still reachable. The first officer checked another display. then exhaled. I think it's a pressure issue. Megan glanced at him. You think? He gave a weak smile. Not my favorite phrase either. The controller's voice returned. You're cleared to land. No other traffic. No delays. No complications. Every runway light was blazing. Every emergency vehicle was waiting. The entire airport had effectively stopped for Flight 782. The aircraft shook again. Crosswinds slammed into the fuselage. Passengers cried out. Megan could feel every movement now. Every gust. Every vibration. Every correction. The airplane felt heavier than before. Less responsive. Not dramatically. Just enough to matter. And right now, everything mattered. 1,000 feet. The runway rapidly expanded ahead. The first officer looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time since she'd entered the cockpit. You know something? What? His smile was faint, but genuine. I would have picked you. Megan laughed nervously. Pick me for what? The man looked forward. For exactly this. For a brief second. Neither said anything. Then, the warning alarm stopped. Just stopped. The sudden silence felt almost louder. 500 feet. The runway now filled the windshield. Rain dark. Lights. Me. Concrete. Hope. Fear. Everything together. The retired captain's voice remained steady. You're lined up. Good. Keep coming. Y'all. Good. A little right correction. Megan adjusted. Perfect. Perfect. A word nobody in aviation trusted. But she appreciated hearing it. 300 feet. Chat. The passengers could now see the runway, too. The realization spread through the cabin instantly. People sat straighter. Held hands tighter. Stopped breathing. The businessman from seat 8B whispered. Come on. Nobody heard him. But half the cabin was thinking the same thing. 100 feet. The aircraft bounced in the wind. Megan corrected. 50 feet. 40. But right here and wide, and in the air. 30. The runway rushed upward. The first officer's voice became barely audible. Easy. 20. 10. The aircraft floated. Refused to settle. A common landing problem. An awful landing problem right now. The runway disappeared beneath them. The wind pushed again. Hard. Then... thump. The main landing gear hit first. Hard enough to shake the entire aircraft. Gasps erupted through the cabin. But Megan wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because they were still moving at over 100 miles per hour. The nose gear touched down. Another jolt. The aircraft drifted left. Megan corrected. The first officer grabbed the armrest. Controllers held their breath. Passengers held theirs. The aircraft continued racing down the runway. Rain spraying everywhere. Emergency lights flashing alongside them. Then, slowly, the speed began falling. 100. 90. Die. At 0 mile. 90. Shook died. 80. 70. 60. The airplane remained centered, stable, controlled. Megan felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for nearly an hour. Hope. 50. 40. 30. The aircraft finally rolled to a stop. Silence. Total silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody seemed willing to believe it. Then the first officer started laughing. A weak, exhausted laugh. But a laugh. Megan stared at him. The man shook his head. We're alive. And suddenly, the cabin exploded. Applause. Cheers. Crying. Prayers. Laughter. Joy. Pure relief. The kind of sound people make when they're given something they thought they might lose. The flight attendants hugged each other. Passengers hugged strangers. One man openly sobbed. Nobody judged him, because half the plane was crying too. Megan leaned back in the captain's seat. Every muscle in her body suddenly remembered it was tired. Very tired. Outside, emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Inside, 148 people slowly realized they were going home. But as paramedics rushed toward the cockpit, Megan noticed something strange. The first officer wasn't laughing anymore. He was staring out the windshield at something in the distance, something only he seemed to recognize. Then he quietly said, "Oh my God." Megan followed his gaze, and what she saw made her forget the landing entirely. For a moment, Megan thought she was imagining it. The rain distorted everything outside. Emergency lights flashed through the storm. Paramedics raced across the tarmac. Vehicles moved in every direction. But standing near one of the airport operations trucks was an elderly man. White hair, blue raincoat, motionless, watching the aircraft. The first officer's face had gone completely pale. Not sick pale. Something else. Something emotional. "Mason?" Megan looked at him. "What?" The first officer swallowed hard, then laughed, softly. A laugh filled with disbelief. "That's my dad." Megan blinked. "What? Ma?" The man pointed toward the window. "He works here." Sure enough, the elderly man began running toward the aircraft. Not quickly, not gracefully, but determined. Like nothing on earth was going to stop him. A few minutes later, after the cockpit door finally opened, paramedics rushed inside. One team attended to the captain. Another checked the first officer. Questions flew everywhere. Medical assessments, vital signs, emergency procedures. The organized chaos of professionals doing their jobs. Then, through all of it, a voice cut across the noise. "Mason, Mason." The first officer turned. His father stood in the doorway, soaked by rain, out of breath, eyes full of fear, the kind of fear only family can feel. For one long second, neither moved. Then the old man stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his son. Mason smiled weakly. "I'm okay." His father immediately shook his head. "No." His voice cracked. "You scared me half to death." For some reason, that moment hit Megan harder than the landing. Maybe because emergencies weren't really about airplanes, or weather, or systems. They were about people. The people waiting for someone to come home. Across the cabin, passengers slowly began deplaning, one row at a time. Many paused near the cockpit. Some simply nodded. Some thanked the crew. Some thanked the flight attendants. And more than a few stopped to thank Megan. She never knew what to say, because the truth felt strange. She didn't feel brave. She felt lucky. Lucky the flight attendants found her. Lucky the first officer stayed conscious long enough to help. Lucky hundreds of people on the ground knew exactly what to do. One woman hugged her without warning, tears streaming down her face. "My granddaughter turns 6 tomorrow." Megan smiled. The woman squeezed her hand. "Thank you," then walked away. Megan stood speechless, because suddenly the emergency had faces. Birthdays, families, grandchildren, lives I've, All the things sitting behind seat numbers. A few hours later, the storm finally passed. The rain stopped. The clouds broke apart, and the airport returned to normal, at least outwardly. Inside a small conference room, Megan sat with airline officials, federal investigators, medical staff, people collecting facts, trying to understand exactly what had happened. The captain had suffered a severe medical emergency. Unexpected. Rare. The first officer had been overwhelmed by a serious foodborne illness. Equally unexpected, the combination was almost impossible. Almost. One investigator shook his head. In 30 years. He stopped, then smiled. I've never seen anything quite like this. Neither had Megan. By midnight, news crews had arrived. Social media had exploded. Passengers were posting videos. Interviews were being requested. Everyone wanted a hero. Megan hated that word, because heroes sounded fearless. And she remembered every second of being terrified. Several days later, she returned home to Oregon. Back to normal life. Or at least she tried to. The problem was, normal life wasn't interested. Phone calls continued. Interview requests multiplied. News stations kept asking the same question. Were you scared? Megan finally started answering honestly. Absolutely. Because she was. The courage wasn't climbing into the cockpit. The courage was staying there. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, a package arrived at her house. No return address. No explanation. Inside was a framed photograph. Flight 782 sitting safely on the runway. Emergency lights surrounding it. Storm clouds breaking overhead. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note. Only one sentence. Thank you for bringing my son home. No signature. None needed. Mason's father. Megan stared at the note for a very long time, then carefully placed it on her bookshelf. Not next to awards. Not next to certificates. Next to family photographs. Where it belonged. Because that was what the flight had always been about. Not aviation. Not headlines. Not viral videos. Family. Months later, Megan received one final surprise. A reunion event organized by several passengers. More than 50 people showed up. Families, children, grandparents, the flight attendants. Mason, even the captain, fully recovered. Stories filled the room. Laughter, too. One little girl approached Megan carrying a drawing. Stick figures. An airplane. A giant rainbow. Very serious artwork. The girl handed it over proudly. My mom says you saved us. Megan looked down at the picture, then smiled. I had a lot of help. The little girl considered that, then nodded, satisfied, as if that answer made perfect sense. Maybe it did, because when Megan thought about Flight 782, she never remembered herself sitting in the cockpit. She remembered the flight attendants, the controllers, the instructors, the first officer fighting to stay conscious, the passengers staying calm. Hundreds of strangers connected by one impossible afternoon. People often talk about miracles as if they happen because of one extraordinary person. But sometimes, miracles happen because ordinary people refuse to give up on each other. And somewhere between fear and courage, between disaster and survival, between a storm and a runway, 148 people made it home. Not because everything went right, but because when everything started going wrong, nobody stopped showing up.
Subscribe my channel Timeless Tales Story and press the bell icon for more inspiring stories.